All right, let's jump right into today's explainer. We're unpacking a completely wild 10th century legend from Egypt. And honestly, this story has absolutely everything. We're talking high stakes diplomacy, deeply personal theological rivalries, a literal ticking clock, and get this, a moving mountain. So let's dive right into how a challenge from a powerful empire brought an entire community right to the edge of total annihilation.
I mean, just sit with the sheer impossibility of that central conflict for a second. What would you do? And remember, we're not talking in metaphors here. The text outlines a scenario where an entire religious community in 10th century Misr, which is what we now call Old Cairo, was handed this terrifying ultimatum by the Fatimid Caliph, al-Muiz. Basically, succeed at the impossible or face the sword. No pressure, right?
So our story really centers on this guy, Pope Abraham the Syrian. He was actually a former wealthy merchant who was somewhat unexpectedly elevated to become the 62nd Patriarch of Alexandria. The text describes him as an older man with a long beard, super well known for his incredible generosity to the poor, and, interestingly enough, he had a genuinely cordial relationship with the Muslim ruler Caliph al-Muiz. But as you'll see, that very friendship is exactly what made him a target.
The real inciting incident of this whole thriller takes place in something called a majlis. Now, think of a majlis as a highly formal, incredibly tense royal court session. You had Muslims, Jews, and Christians all debating theology directly in front of the political elite. It was an arena of ideas, sure, but the political stakes were just sky high. And there was this prosperous Jewish merchant named Musa who was intensely jealous of Pope Abraham's friendship with the Caliph. He wanted to use this specific arena to embarrass the Christian leader. Well, things escalated quickly. Pope Abraham brings this brilliant bishop named Severus to debate Musa, and Severus just decides to go on the offensive. He drops this incredibly harsh verse from the book of Isaiah to completely humiliate Musa in front of the Caliph, essentially arguing that God called farm animals more intelligent than Musa. The text notes that the Caliph actually admired the rhetorical trap, but man, it sparked a bitter, deadly desire for revenge from Musa. And that humiliation led directly to a brilliant, deadly trap. Musa's powerful ally, the vizier Ibn Khilis, whispered an idea to the caliph. He pointed out that the Christian gospel literally claims that faith the size of a mustard seed can command a mountain to move. So he says, why not test the literal truth of this claim? The caliph actually agreed. He demanded that Pope Abraham performed this exact miracle or face the annihilation of all Christians in the land. And how long did the caliph give him? Exactly 3 days. That's it. A 3-day countdown to a potential massacre. The text paints this incredibly vivid picture of Abraham rushing back to the famous hanging church in Old Cairo. He orders every monk, priest, and believer into unceasing prayer, intense weeping, and a total fast. For 3 straight days and nights, Abraham himself refused to sleep, just standing and praying until he was physically collapsing from exhaustion. Then, on the morning of that terrifying 3rd day, with the caliph's envoys practically knocking at the door, the text claims the Virgin Mary appeared to a heartbroken Abraham in a vision. And she didn't just give him the power to move the mountain himself. Instead, she gave him a bizarrely specific set of instructions. Go to the market gate and find a one-eyed water carrier. This completely unknown, unlikely man was apparently going to be the one to save his people. Which brings us to the shocking backstory of the man Abraham actually found, Simon the Tanner. The text goes out of its way to detail the extreme, almost terrifying level of devotion this guy possessed. Back when he was a shoemaker, he was once tempted by the sight of a beautiful woman's leg. Recalling the gospel command that it's better to lose an eye than to sin, the text says he literally took a metal leather punch and tore out his own eye. Deemed mad by society, he became a humble water carrier for the poor. But this was the man who supposedly had the faith to move a mountain. So, the deadline is officially up. The caliph leads a massive crowd out to the foot of the Muqattam mountain. Pope Abraham, Simon the Tanner, the bishops, and a huge crowd carrying crosses, censers, and candles, they all march out to face the impossible. The tension described in the source material is just palpable. I mean, they are standing before a massive geological formation, literally waiting for it to move. The text outlines this highly structured, incredibly suspenseful sequence of events once they arrive. The Christians actually ask for fairness, requesting that the Muslim sheikhs pray first. They do, and nothing happens. The mountain remains completely still. Then the Jewish rabbis pray. Exact same result. The caliph is growing impatient, threatening immediate execution. And finally, it's the Christians' turn. Now, the Christian crowd didn't just pray quietly.
The text says they began to chant Kyrie eleison, which means Lord have mercy, a staggering 400 times. Just try to imagine the sheer volume and desperation of thousands of people chanting this over and over again. Finally, with Simon standing right behind him, Pope Abraham steps up and orders the mountain to uproot itself and come toward them. And the climax of this narrative isn't described as some gentle, magical floating rock. It's depicted as a terrifying, earth-shattering catastrophe. The mountain actually lifted and moved. There was a deafening noise, and massive earthquakes rocked the land so violently that people thought the resurrection and the end of the world had actually arrived. The text even makes a point to note that the shaking was so intense, pregnant women in the surrounding areas went into sudden labor. This display of power was so overwhelming that the Caliph himself was completely gripped by terror. According to the legend, he cries out to Pope Abraham, begging him to stop the mountain from moving any further before it just crushed and annihilated everyone present. Abraham gives the command, the mountain settles back down, and just like that, the survival of the Christian community is secured.
But what's truly fascinating is that the story doesn't just end with the earthquake. The physical miracle immediately pivots into this really intimate, high-level theological debate. That very same evening, behind closed doors, a deeply shaken Caliph summons Pope Abraham. He acknowledges the miracle, for sure, but then immediately starts questioning the core tenets of Christianity, specifically the incarnation, and how God could possibly have a son. So, the text impartially lays out the theological debate between these two powerful leaders. Pope Abraham uses elements that would be familiar to the Caliph, noting the Quranic respect for Jesus as a miracle worker who spoke in the cradle and healed the sick. He then contrasts this directly with the Christian view, defending the really complex nature of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as one substance, and the concept of the incarnate Word existing before creation. It's a really deep dive into their respective beliefs. Convinced by the overwhelming physical miracle and that subsequent debate, the text claims a massive transformation took place in the Caliph. Not only did he authorize and fund the rebuilding of major ruined churches from his own personal treasury, but the text actually claims he eventually abdicated. It states he left his empire secretly through a hidden gate to become a baptized, ascetic monk in the wilderness. It's a pretty wild turn of events. Yet, despite his monumental victory that literally saved his people, Pope Abraham's story ends in total tragedy. You see, he was incredibly uncompromising in his morals. Just months after moving the mountain, he excommunicated a powerful, corrupt official who refused to give up his concubines. In revenge, that official slipped Abraham a deadly poison. The man who supposedly moved a mountain was assassinated after just 3.5 years in power. So, I'll leave you with this final thought as we wrap up this explainer. When we look at ancient texts and legends like this, we really have to ask ourselves, are we reading a literal geological event? Or are we seeing how a marginalized community used the literature of miracles to navigate the incredibly high stakes of history, survival, and faith against an all-powerful empire? It is a truly remarkable window into how stories shape human survival. Thanks for joining me on this one.